So I hope that you've enjoyed and learned something from Aftermath, my documentary about the destruction and rebuilding of Misquamicut Beach. It is an important lesson that we have not perhaps learned enough about what can and should be done, if not to avert a storm, since we cannot control Mother Nature, but actually to figure out ways that we can preserve lives and property and still have a viable community that understands and realizes the strength and the power of Mother Nature. My goal is to create a new documentary. This one focused much more on what did we learn. 5 years later, what have we learned that we can now go forward with? What has changed in the aftermath of Storm Sandy? That is mostly the focus of my new documentary. We know one thing for sure, and that is that we changed some of the policy of the National Hurricane Center. Before Storm Sandy, the National Hurricane Center in Miami would cease to have overview and purview of all of the warnings, the evacuation, all of the things that were happening because the storm stopped being a hurricane and simply became a tropical depression or became something less than a hurricane. The new policy after Storm Sandy is that the National Hurricane Center, with all of its scientists, all its meteorologists, all its ability to get the news out, will remain in charge under its purview, regardless of whether or not when it hits the United States, it isn't still a hurricane. So that's an important message, and that has been changed. But the second thing, and probably more important than anything else, is this whole concept of a strategic retreat. Is there a point at which we simply cannot have people living so very close to the coastline? Here in Rhode Island, we have a perfect example of strategic retreat, not necessarily planned as such, but what actually happened in Napattree Point, near Watch Hill, after the hurricane of 1938. On Napattree Point, there were some 30 cottages and homes. After that hurricane, they were all destroyed. And the question became whether to rebuild. And there was a conscientious decision made not to rebuild. And if you go to Napattree Point today, you'll find a beautiful coastline, but in fact, no houses. The remains of an old fort, but again, no houses. And in fact, Napattree Point has shifted and changed in terms of its whole coastline as a result of Mother Nature. But there was no fears about saving lives because people were not living there. So that is an example of strategic retreat, and that is something that we're going to talk about in the next documentary. There have been examples of that also done in Staten Island, where Storm Sandy hit mercilessly and killed a number of people. A bunch of homes were bought out by the city with, I'm sure, federal and state money, and it's no longer going to be a place where people live. It's simply going to be a park. These are other places along the coastline where, in fact, we might start to think about strategic retreat. So I hope that this has piqued your interest and that you now want to go forward and can't wait to see the next documentary, which will be about the things that we've learned 5 years after Superstorm Sandy. So join me again sometime in the future when we'll talk about what the lessons to be learned. Thank you very much. This is Harriet Grayson, your host and producer of Community Culture Showcase.